trauma psychologist, I think it's important to tag that we are now being exposed to secondary trauma.
That video there completely stopped me in my tracks because I didn't know what secondary trauma was until it completely ruined and took over my life. So I'm actually studying and training to become a solicitor, but I'm also an advocate for victims of miscarriages of justice and children who are victims or have been victims of certain crimes. So I spent a lot of my own time, researching historical cases and stuff like that. Now, secondary trauma is a psychological response that can develop after repeated exposure to another person's trauma or the details of traumatic events. It's often seen in advocates, solicitors, barristers, social workers, police officers, therapists, journalists, and healthcare professionals who are regularly exposed to traumatic events or traumatic material. Some research also suggests, people with ADHD may be at high risk, although it can affect anyone. The warning signs can include intrusive thoughts, nightmares, anxiety, depression, emotional numbness, difficulty sleeping, changing in appetite, becoming withdrawn, struggling to function, increased alcohol use, hopelessness, and in severe cases, you would have extremely dark thoughts of, unaliving yourself. So James Bulger's case was bad enough. That's when I first started noticing, the symptoms. I became more emotional. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd read, and intrusive thoughts started to creep in. But Emmett Till's case is what completely sent me over the edge. It was such a hard reality to sit with. I couldn't comprehend how grown men could inflict that level of violence on a 14-year-old child, someone who visibly looked like a child, who was still developing, still innocent, with his whole life ahead of him. I kept asking myself, what kind of world do we live in where people do that to a child? The more I learned, the more it consumed me. I developed severe secondary trauma. I started having really dark thoughts and thoughts of unaliving myself because I simply could not cope with the reality anymore. I couldn't go to work, I couldn't go to university, I could barely eat. Most days I'll spend lying in bed. I started drinking alcohol just to numb what I was feeling, and I'm not a drinker at all. But, the intrusive thoughts became relentless. I kept replaying what had happened over and over in my mind, and I couldn't switch my brain off. Kept reading certain materials, looking at certain pictures. That's what it was starting to do to me. And I also started waking up at around 2:30 every night, around the same time that Emmett Till was kidnapped. And it got so bad that I wouldn't even let my own son sleep in his own bed because I was terrified that something might happen to him. Looking back, I know that wasn't a rational response, but it just goes to show you how much the trauma had taken over my life. But I am now under the care of doctors, nurses, mental health professionals, and a support worker, as well as other support I have. I'm also taking medication, and although I'm trying to recover, I'm still really struggling. But if you recognize any of those warning signs in yourself, please don't ignore them. Speak to your GP, speak to a mental health professional or someone you trust, because secondary trauma is real, and the sooner you reach out for help, the better chances you have of recovering.